All right, welcome. Today we're going to trace the journey a company takes when it decides to go global. And what's so fascinating is that it starts with things like business strategy and logistics, but it always ends up being about something way more human. How do you build a team that actually reflects the world?
Okay, so let's dive right in. Picture this. You've got a super successful local company. They're crushing it. And they decide, you know what? It's time to conquer the world. They've got the product, they've got the team, but what's the very first step on that huge, massive journey?
So here's the game plan for today. We're going to break this all down into 6 key parts. We'll start with the basics, the first business steps. Then we'll look at the kind of identity a global company can even have. And then we're going to get into the really interesting stuff, the cultural and human side of it all. We'll talk about the power of diversity, the reality of workplace bias, and wrap it all up with what it really means to have a global mindset.
All right, first things first, taking those initial steps. Look, going global isn't like flipping a switch and suddenly you're everywhere. No, it's more like wading into the water. It's a careful process, You often start small and then you build up from there. It's all about managing your risk and your level of commitment.
So you can really think of this as a kind of ladder of global investment, right? At the very bottom, with the least amount of risk, a company might just start by sourcing materials or labor from other countries. Easy enough. Then maybe they start exporting their own stuff. As they get more confident, they start climbing that ladder, licensing their brand, forming partnerships, all the way up to the very top rung. And that's where they make the huge commitment of building their own independent operation abroad, a foreign subsidiary. Okay, so our company is officially global. They're operating in different countries. But now comes a really big question. What's its personality going to be? How is it actually going to manage itself across all these totally different markets?
Well, one option is to basically be a chameleon. This is what we call a multi-domestic corporation. The whole idea is to decentralize power. You let the local team in each country call the shots. Nestle is the perfect example here, right? They change their products to fit what locals actually want. That's why a Kit Kat in Japan tastes completely different and comes in way more flavors than one you'd find in the UK. Now, the total opposite approach? To be a titan. This is the global corporation. Here, all the power is centralized back at the home office, and they standardize everything. The classic example, of course, is Apple. An iPhone is an iPhone. It doesn't matter if you buy it in California or Cairo. It's the exact same product. The brand, the experience, it's consistent all over the world. And then you've got this third, pretty radical approach, the borderless organization. Just imagine a company that tries to completely erase national divisions. They pull the best talent, the best resources from literally anywhere on the planet, all to be as efficient as possible. It's really about creating one single truly integrated global entity. So it really boils down to this fundamental choice, this contrast. Do you give your local teams the power to customize everything for their market, like Nestle does? Or do you keep all the control at headquarters and sell the exact same standardized product everywhere, like Apple? And listen, there's no single right answer. Each approach has its own major strengths.
All right, so we've covered corporate structure. Now let's shift gears and get to the really human element of all this. Because once you're operating globally, you're not just dealing with different markets, you are dealing with profoundly different cultures. And believe me, that means you're navigating a whole new set of unwritten rules. Now, this might look a little complex at first glance, but it's actually an incredibly powerful map for understanding all those cultural differences. It was created by a researcher named Geert Hofstee, and he identified these key, let's call them dimensions, that really help explain why a workplace in one country can feel so different from another. Let's just look at a couple of the big ones. Okay, first up, individualism versus collectivism. And this one's pretty straightforward. Is the culture all about me, or is it all about we? Think about it. In a really individualistic culture, you praise a single person for a job well done. But in a collectivistic one, you praise the entire team. You can imagine how this changes absolutely everything about motivation and teamwork. Okay, then there's something called power distance. This one is all about how a culture views authority. So, for example, in a high-power distance culture, an employee would probably never dream of publicly disagreeing with their boss. But in a low-power distance culture, that same employee might actually be expected to challenge ideas no matter who they come from. That completely changes the whole dynamic of a meeting, right? And here's where this all starts to connect in a really cool way. When you have a global presence, it almost automatically leads to a diverse workforce. And that diversity, if you can manage it well, isn't just a nice thing to have. It can be an incredible competitive advantage. A real superpower for the business.
But what do we even mean by diversity? Because it really operates on two levels. You've got surface-level diversity, that's the stuff we can all easily see. Age, race, gender. But the real magic, the real power, happens with deep-level diversity. That's all the unseen stuff, the differences in our values, our personalities, and how we prefer to work.
And when you actually tap into that deep-level diversity, the benefits are huge. Suddenly you get better problem solving because you have all these different perspectives in the room. You get a much, much deeper understanding of your diverse customers around the world. And what does all that lead to? Innovation. See, this isn't just about a social goal. It is a powerful, powerful business strategy. But let's be real for a second. Bringing all these different people together isn't always a walk in the park. With all that diversity comes a huge challenge. We have to manage our own inherent biases. We all have them. And you gotta face those internal dragons head on. So let's just break this down. What even is a bias? At its core, it's just a tendency or a preference for one thing over another. It's basically a mental shortcut our brains use to make sense of a really complex world. And here's the key. Absolutely everyone has them.
Now, that bias starts to become a real problem when it hardens and turns into prejudice. Prejudice is a preconceived belief or judgment about a person or a whole group of people, and it's usually formed without any real evidence. It is literally a prejudgment, and it's almost always negative.
And then, when we act on that prejudice, that's when we get stereotyping. This is when we judge an individual person not for who they are, but based on our perception of a group they belong to. We're taking a broad and usually inaccurate assumption and slapping it onto a real, live human being.
And right here, this is the real-world impact of all those biases in action. This chart is basically the glass ceiling visualized with data. Just look at it. The workforce is pretty diverse at the entry level, right? But watch what happens as you move up the corporate ladder. That diversity just shrinks and shrinks. The percentage of white men goes up at every single step, while the representation for women and for men of color just drops off a cliff, especially when you get to the very top.
So the big question is, how on earth do you overcome all these challenges and actually harness the incredible power of a global team? Well, it's not just about writing new HR policies. It requires cultivating a completely new way of thinking. It requires a global mindset.
So what does that even mean, a global mindset? Well, it really boils down to three key pillars. First, you need intellectual capital. That just means you know your stuff about international business. Second, you need psychological capital. This is about being genuinely open-minded, open to new experiences and ideas. And finally, you need social capital. This is the ability, the skill to build real, trusting relationships with people who are very different from you.
So there you have it. We've traced the entire playbook, all the way from a company's very first step into a new country to the incredibly complex human dynamics of managing a global team. And in the end, so much of it comes down to building this very specific mindset. So I'll leave you with a final question to think about. How developed is your own global mindset?